I'm Gabe. I am part of our engineering team, and I've been working with a number of folks on this call on our My Developers product for a while. So it's nice to get the opportunity to chat about it with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know it's visible. Can I get a thumbs up from folks? Cool. Thank you so much. So yeah, today we would like to talk about the My Developers feature in context of our new editing experience. So as some of you may have heard in the past, but for those of you who haven't, we have refreshed ReadMe and really are trying to make the focal point around developers and API documentation, both from a management perspective and really getting closer to how your users are using your API documentation, but also in terms of understanding your users at a better level so you can support them proactively. So what I'm showing right now among a few tabs is README on the left-hand side of my screen. Is it large enough for folks to see it, or should I make it any larger? I'm getting a thumbs up. All right, cool. So what you'll notice first out of the block, I've just created a new project here at README. I've landed on our new viewing experience, which this may be familiar to many of you. This looks like our existing documentation hub. What you will see is that there is a new tab right at the top. There are actually two new tabs. One is our edit tab, which is, as some of you may be familiar with, modifying your documentation right here at its source. But again, we're really trying to push the importance of developer experience here. So we have a brand new tab as well called My Developers. This My Developers tab is kind of the starting place for you to start getting insight as to what users are using your API, how they're using your API, what you can do to kind of invest in it and help them be successful in their use of it. So what you'll see is, a quick onboarding screen. You can see some nice aspects of things that are offered in this tool, which is very cute. But really what I'm trying to do is set this tool up so that I can make the most use out of it. So at README, a lot of us use JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and use one of our multiple offerings. We have SDKs to use this functionality among a number of languages. A new one actually coming soon is Java. I think that's highly requested, so that's coming in the very near future. But today, we have 5 languages and more frameworks on top of that. I am going to click Node, and what I will see here is a quick code snippet of how I would actually set this functionality up. There are a few key pieces of information here that are relevant to what we're chatting about today. First of all, you will see that there's an API key here. Yes, I am leaking a README API key for this test project. Don't worry too much about that, but this token is what we use at README to identify your middleware with your project. We can use this information to tie any API calls that come into our system with your project so that you can see your information. The next few pieces of information are API key. We do call this API key today, but this is really any identifier for your users in your system. This could be an OAuth client ID. It could be a header that you use for identifying users. It really could be anything that you're interested in using. Essentially, what we do is use this information to give context on users in your system and to tag and connect the dots of any users using your API, especially with how they would actually see it in their documentation. We'll touch on this a little bit more later. Next is a label. This is pretty straightforward of how you want to call your users or whoever is using that auth token. And finally is an email address for whoever is using and making this request. We use this to kind of get additional information on your users, to decorate them with information on the company that they're in, among other pieces of information. So behind the scenes, we've actually set this up, and I'm actually going to just make an API call right now. We should see this onboarding complete. We have a nice little Postman widget, so I'm going to go ahead and make a request right here. We can see that we've received our request. And if I click finish, we should see this come in soon. Behind the scenes, our system has a queue, so there's a moment where it it takes a second to actually make a request. So we made a GET request. I'm going to filter. There we go. A request came in. So what we can see here is our My Developers feature. What you will see is a number of key pieces of information. One is the main data table. This is really a high level of your users, how they're using your service, and can really give you kind of a snapshot of their usage over time, what their most recent request was. Was it a failure? Was it successful? Do you need to do anything to actually support them through this process? But if I'm coming into this feature set brand new, I may not exactly know what I'm looking for, right? So we offer a set of filters. You can filter by a user's email or an API key, additionally an ID that we have in our system internally. But more importantly, we have this kind of filter facet section. So if I'm, for example, just releasing a new endpoint as part of my API, and I'm really curious about how customers are using that, I can filter very easily by that endpoint and actually see the users that have made a request to that endpoint. So here we can see the requests that I just made. That allows us to essentially dig into a set of information. If you have a ton of users using your service, you may not exactly know what you're initially looking for, but you may have an idea of how you want to come into this tool of, okay, again, there's an API a new endpoint that I need to support, or there's a particular user who's reached out to me and said, oh, I'm having trouble with your API. Can you help me out? And you can use this information to very easily drill into how they've used their request. So this is really just a high level, but if I want to see the actual request the user has made, I can actually go ahead and click on that. You'll see a similar view, but I can very easily click into this and see the request itself as to, what the user did. So I can then use this information to know exactly what they've done in their request. If they did have a failure, I could use that to give them context in our support thread. You'll also see information like the headers they've used. We like to give little tooltips on explanations. I know not everyone is deeply familiar with HTTP headers. I know I personally am not, so these are very helpful for sure. And I can use this information to just get more context on the requests that are coming into my system. So yeah, that is kind of My Developers at a whole. What I just clicked into is looking into an API key. So the API key or the ID that was used for the request itself. But I can also get context on a particular user and their usage. Oh, live demos. Let me refresh this page. So there we go. We can actually see information based off our particular user. If I want to slice and dice my request based off a user versus an API key, I can see things like the top endpoints that a user has made, the keys that they've used, and then I can see, okay, maybe they're having a higher error rate than normal for most of my users, and I need to give particular attention to these folks. One of the other metrics that we are very interested in here at ReadMe is time to 200. This is the first time that someone's navigated to your documentation versus the first time that they've made a successful call on your API. And we are very, we try our best to support users and having the shortest time to 200 as possible so that they have kind of a seamless experience onboarding into your API. So yeah, I think with that, we would like to navigate to the end user perspective. So what I've just spoken about is really coming from an API owner's perspective and trying to understand my users and best support them. But what happens if I'm an end user coming to this documentation and wanting to get the most out of my experience? With that, I will pass it to Anand.
Cool. Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, it was great. This is kind of a good way for the API owners to kind of, overview how their API is going. But as an API user, I feel like this would also be useful for me as well. For example, when I'm kind of working with an API one day, and then I get pulled onto another project, then a week later I have to come back in and look, kind of where I left off. I can kind of look back through my API logs, and that'd be useful, like what I sent in the post request, if I was getting errors, where I was having the most trouble. So to set that up, all we have to do is go into the configuration views, and you can see right here, we can add a getting started page, authentication, and my request. So to kind of start setting this up, all we would do is we need to create an authentication route. So if you saw before where the API keys kind of we were giving that to the user and or to our system. And the reason we're giving those API keys is we can also offer them here on the documentation page. So if we go to the setup screen, yep, cool. Yeah, so the getting started page is how you would, the first thing that a developer would see. You can kind of configure the endpoint, the main endpoint uh, for a user to kind of get started with that API right away. That requires an auth. Usually we recommend an endpoint. So whenever a user comes here, that we can provision an API key for them, and they can go ahead and hit the, yeah, here's how you would select one of the things. So like the get pet store ID is a perfect one to use. And that would be the first route that a user would see whenever they view the page, once this page is visible. And then once that's all set up, we can go to the authentication section. And here's what we basically have two things we can do here. If you have AWS, we're working on a kind of integration to go and get API keys from AWS Gateway. However, if you have your own authentication scheme, we can actually make a webhook where anytime a user logs into the page, we would send you a webhook request, and then you would just return to us what keys are available to that user, and that would be populated. So yeah, so this is kind of what it would look like. We have an AWS integration. If you have AWS API gateway set up, all you would do is give us permission to read and create API keys. We can do that out of the box. But again, we love Node.js, so if we could just create a quick Node.js example. And so this is what a typical webhook would look like written in Node.js. We would get the user information, and then we would look in our database or however we're storing our credentials, and we would return that API key as a JSON object with API key. And we should already have that set up. So if we go to our URL here and hit the webhook route, and this is what kind of we would send you. We would send this email. So if I was logged into ReadMe, we would send this, and this would be the response on the back end. And now, that looks right to me. So we can go ahead and save that as our webhook. And now that that's done, we should have everything piped up. So when a user goes back to the site and logs in, ooh, now you can see in the authentication header and stuff is already there. You can see what requests were put in. So this was the request that was made before. And now you have your own request. You can see kind of this is what the request was made through Gabe's account because he was logged in. And as he makes more requests, you can see all the response pages, the response bodies for your own usage. Now this can be whether it's your app or your own personal token that you're using somewhere. So you can keep track without having to instrument this outside. You can see how you're kind of using this API and where you're hitting the most issues, or what was the last time you had a 200 here and what did that request look like. And yeah, so you could also see on the pages, you can see broken down by path. So here you can see that 9 minutes ago I made a 200, or Gabe made a 200 request with a Postman agent, and you can see kind of all the parameters and the response bodies there. And yeah, that's so from a developer side, that's kind of what we have to offer as well. And it's pretty useful whenever you're first getting started with an API. You see all the history that you've made, and also keep track of all the requests that you're making, or if you're having trouble with it, you can kind of go deep dive in and see what you did before to make it work, or kind of what parameters you were using to fix it.